This is part 3 of the Team Associated RC10 B5M Factory Lite build series. And in part 3, I basically went through parts bag C, which involves mounting the front arms to the bulkhead and the front bumper, mounting the front tower, the rear arms, and the rear tower, and the rear bulkhead, I guess you can call it that. So a few comments here. The whole front assembly goes together much like the RC10 B5 rear motor chassis. There's not really any surprises here. When I built the B5, I had noted that the hinge pins on the inner hinge pins for the front arms tended to fit rather tight, and so the arms don't get very free movement. And what some people were doing at that time was taking the black coating off of the hinge pins to buy a little bit of margin to add to some, to get some smooth movement on the front suspension arms. I didn't have to do that. I did notice that on my B5. On the B5M, maybe they updated the molds, or maybe they changed something on the hinge pins. I don't know. But I did a completely stock build, did not modify any parts, and both the left and right arms seem to move pretty freely. There's no real significant binding or anything like that. So that's an improvement over the B5, or at the very least the early generation B5. Maybe if you get a B5 rear motor now, it may build just like this. It may, the arms may move smoothly without doing any modifications. So that appears to be an improvement to the kit, or at least the particular kit that I have. Moving on to the rear, the first thing you start with when building the rear is putting the front rear inner hinge pin mount in place, and then you put the rear mount in place with the arms and hinge pins. Now, what's interesting about the front rear mounts here, you'll probably see the text that says 3+1. Maybe the camera's not focusing too well. So that means 3 degrees of anti-squat and 1 degree of toe-in, and you get a 2+5 or 2.5+2 mount and a 3+2 mount as well. So the reason I say that's interesting is because some other manufacturers, what they do is they'll give you a single block here, and they'll have inserts kind of where you see these squares here, and there'll be little plastic inserts, and those inserts will have the holes offset from center by a certain amount for both the front rear and the rear mount. But here you have basically a single fixed part. So if you want to change the anti-squat or the toe-in from the inner hinge pin mounts, you have to change this actual brace out. So, okay, you take 2 screws out, pop this out, put another one back in, should be no big deal. But without having everything else mounted, like the gearbox and the motor, I don't know exactly how easy it would be to take this out. It might actually be not so straightforward. You might actually have to take the gearbox out just to have space to take this out. It would be more convenient in that case if you actually had inserts in here, so that way I can just take the arms out and then, from this direction, take the insert out, put a different insert in, and, adjust my toe and my anti-squat as I wanted to. So it is what it is. I can't really say I have strong opinions about it either way. The advantage of having a single part here is that when you have inserts, the inserts can wear both at the hinge pin hole as well as the interface between the housing and the insert. So you can end up with some slop in 2 places rather than a single part like this, where the slop may only take place at this one spot here at the hinge pin mounting hole. Okay, so you got to pick your poison there. The way that the rear bumper mounts, this is probably my first real complaint. It's kind of a pain, because what you have to do is you mount the rear inner hinge pin mount onto the chassis, and there's a gap between that mount and the chassis that you have to slot this rear bumper into, and it's not a flat gap. It's actually an indented gap. Maybe if I can show it here, you can see here the chassis itself has a little indentation between these two rear holes. Okay, and then over here, sorry, the rear hinge pin mount has a similar indentation on the inside, on the surface that you can't see in this image here. And so the bumper has two little lips on either side of the surface of the bumper that slot into this guy and the chassis. So it tells you to mount this first, and so then you have this gap between the mount and the chassis, and you have to slot this piece in, but you can't do that without actually having to like stress this whole thing or push this up to slot this in. And I just found it to be, it's not exactly hard, it's just a little fiddly. I think it would have been nicer if instead they had, no gap here between the rear mount and the chassis, so you just mount this mount and that's all said and done, and then maybe you just mount the rear bumper into a separate set of holes on the chassis that are countersunk, of course. And that would just make it easier, I think, to mount the bumper and the rear hinge pin mount. So that's probably my first sort of real complaint outside of the set screw complaint I had mentioned in the previous video. One thing I do like, though, that I think is really nice is the inner ball stud mount. I guess you could call this some kind of a bulkhead if you want. It actually mounts in two directions. So right now you have, it's the factory settings to mount it in the -2mm direction, which basically means if I look at this head on, okay, the surface upon which the ball stud mounts is flat, okay, -2mm, I think, from the top surface here, okay. Now if I flip this over and I mount it so the +2mm side is facing up, then this lip here is where the ball stud mounts on, so that will push the ball stud up, okay. So that basically allows you more adjustability with roll center. So if I want the rear end to have a larger tendency to roll while the car is cornering, then I would want to drop the roll center. You drop the roll center by raising the inner ball stud, okay? And that moves the roll center down, and so your roll moment increases, the car rolls more. So in that case, if I want more roll, I would flip this over so the +2mm side is facing up, or alternately, I can just add more and more spacers under this ball stud. And then if I want to raise the roll center so that the roll center and the center of gravity are in closer proximity, that reduces the tendency of the chassis to roll. And so I would want to drop the ball stud. So I can either flip this to the -2 slide like it is now, and or remove spacers from the inner ball stud, okay? So I think it's a nice feature that you can just flip it, over one way or the other. In the previous generation, the fourth generation chassis, like the B4, the T4, you had a single, I think it was called a U-brace, which is basically the same thing that these ball studs mounted on. And they would come with a lip, much like the +2mm side of this thing. And what a lot of people would do is just shave that lip off so that it was flat, so that they're basically starting off with a flat surface, and then they could start with a higher roll center, and then have more adjustability for dropping the roll center from that point forward by incrementally increasing the height of the ball stud. But here they kind of address that by just giving you this swappable, if you want to call it that, ball stud mount, where you can literally flip it over and mount the ball stud either at a +2 or a -2. It gives you more options. So I think that's really cool. And I just want to point out that despite my two prior complaints with the rear bumper mount and the set screws, I think this is a really nice little feature. Oops, camera lost focus. Okay, so what's going on here? Hold on a second. There we go. All right, so this is it for parts bag C. The towers mount relatively straightforward. There's nothing really to report there. Again, the same as the B5 at the front, and at the rear tower, maybe this is partly why the bumper is a little fiddly. The rear tower mounts through the same two screws that mount the bumper and the rear hinge pin mount. So there's two really long screws. I think they're 18mm screws. And so you have to put the rear arm mount on, or the hinge pin mount on, slot the bumper in there, hold that in place, hold the tower in place, and then screw these two screws through the chassis hole, the bumper hole, the hinge pin mount hole, and into the tower. So that's probably the most fiddly part of this build so far. But hopefully everything else will be straightforward. Parts bag D, the infamous D bag, is building the diff, building the gearbox, mounting it, and then we get on to the rear hub carriers and the rest of the drivetrain. Oh, that gets to parts bag H, and then, you know, suspension, blah, blah, blah. So I'll keep going with this, and I'll probably make another video either after the gearbox, because I have some interesting notes on that already, and or after once I've gotten to maybe the turnbuckles here. So we'll see. In the meantime, that's it for now, and thanks for watching.